Today I wanted to talk about the importance of reading classics in the present day. Because I recently rebranded my channel from Reading with Jack to Tomes and Travel, I was thinking about the beginnings of my BookTube channel 5 or 6 years ago when I started, and I wanted to consider the kind of reader I was then and the kind of reader I am now. One of the main things that seems to have changed over the years is my attitude towards classics. Particularly kind of very old classics, maybe from the 1800s, but also classics from the 1900s, which are considered modern classics. If I'm really honest, when I started BookTube, I was quite ignorant about classics, and I just didn't think they were for me. I was never against people that read classics, and when I saw people talking about them, I definitely admired them. But I couldn't personally see why I would be interested in reading them. I can really distinctly remember when I used to go book buying when I first started BookTube, and the Waterstones that I usually go in is quite a wide shop. On the left is all the adults and the classics books, and then on the right hand side is all the young adult fiction. I used to just gravitate towards the YA section and never really look at the classics because I would maybe pick up 4 or 5 young adult books and then I would go to the till and pay for them, and I would never actually get around to the classics. Now when I go into a bookshop, it's kind of the opposite. Usually I go to the classics and the adult section first, and then kind of work my way around to the young adult section. I think when I realised that I liked classics, my whole attitude towards them changed. It was probably when I started doing English literature for A-level about 4 years ago, and I was forced to read classics as part of my course. I had to read the likes of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and also modern classics like The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Before actually starting that course, I can honestly say I probably wouldn't have really picked any of those books up. But when I had to read them, when it was compulsory, I actually realised that these books are really fun to read, they're really interesting, and also they're really important and they still have great significance today. As I studied the classics more and more, I started to buy some to read in my free time, which were not necessarily compulsory for my course. I just wanted to read them for fun. I'm not an expert in classics, and there are still quite a lot that I haven't read, but clearly I think I can say that I am changing in my attitudes towards them, and I do actually want to read more. Unlike in the past when I started BookTube, when I used to think classics were just distant and not really relevant to the present, actually, they are relevant to the present, and they can teach us quite a lot about what we're currently going through. For example, with maybe Charles Dickens, he talks a lot about poverty and inequality, obviously in a very specific historical context, which is not necessarily the same as today, but these are still issues that are happening today. There are many countries with high levels of poverty and inequality. We still need to fight against these issues. Because these issues still exist, the classics are still important because we can consider the origins of these issues. We can think about how people explored and approached these issues at the time, and also how people approach them today, because obviously kind of worldviews are changing all the time, and we don't necessarily hold the same views as the classic writers had, but we can still see similarities. It's the same with maybe Jane Eyre, or in fact any of the books by the Bronte sisters. They're usually examined, particularly today, in light of theories to do with gender and things like that. It was a very important issue at the time, the approaches to women in Jane Eyre, but also it's still important today. You know, attitudes are changing all the time, and I don't think it would be fair just to completely ignore the classics because they're actually dealing with similar issues, albeit in a different context. I think Jane Eyre is a classic that actually people have learned a lot more about as literature and literary theories have developed over time. A good example of this is post-colonialism, which is a school of literary theory which is kind of growing in significance all the time. Post-colonial theorists have certainly learned a lot about Jane Eyre because they're post-colonialists. They've looked at Rochester, for example, and the origins of his wealth, which actually come from plantations in the Caribbean where there were a lot of slaves. We can actually see the dark side of his wealth, which is kind of hidden a little bit in the novel by Bronte, the original novel. It's kind of there in the background, but it's never really explicit. In relation to Jane Eyre as well, quite a lot of books have been written about that and kind of inspired by that, because Jean Rhys's Wives Sargasso Sea, for example, looks at the character of Bertha Mason, who in the original novel is this mad woman in the attic. She doesn't really have much space, she doesn't really have a voice or anything. And then in Jean Rhys's novel, she actually kind of expands on the kind of past behind this character. She looks at the origins of Bertha Mason in the Caribbean and her relationship to Rochester at the time and how they came to England. It's a very dark past, it's very tragic and quite upsetting as well. But clearly, different writers have constantly throughout time seen the importance of classics, and they've used classics to explore issues like colonialism and slavery. The importance of Jane Eyre continues today. In fact, I actually had to study a Puerto Rican retelling of Jane Eyre as part of my university degree. Most of you probably already know, but I do Hispanic studies, and I had to read this Caribbean retelling which was written in the 1990s, I think, and obviously that's still kind of not that long ago, so it's clearly showing that Jane Eyre is still important, as are other classics. It was this classic that basically used Jane Eyre and the governess novel as a starting point for exploring the sugar plantations in Puerto Rico in the 1800s and the inequality that happened there, and a lot of the suffering, and in fact the zombification of some of the plantation workers. It's called Miss Florence's Trunk, or El Baúl de Miss Florence in Spanish. I read it in Spanish because I'm doing Spanish as my degree, but there is also an English translation in the collection True and False Romances. So if you're interested in a Jane Eyre retelling that probably most people haven't even heard of before, you should definitely check that one out. It's a really interesting one, and if you want to know more about it, let me know in the comments. What we can really see from all of this is that the issues explored in classics still have great importance today. People are still thinking about these issues. These issues have not suddenly disappeared because we're living in the 21st century. As much as we can learn about what happened in the past, when we read classics, we can also learn a lot about the present and what's happening now. Obviously, different worldviews have changed over time, but still exploring issues like poverty and inequality and gender, all those things are still very important today. And if we look into the classics, we can kind of think about the origins of those issues, how they were explored, how they were approached at the time, and then how we approach them today. I guess what I'm saying is that classics are not just something of the past, they are something of the present as well. They were important in the past, they obviously helped people to explore certain issues, but they can also help us explore the same issues today, albeit in a different context. I really want to recommend that people maybe try and explore classics more, because I know when I started BookTube, as I said at the beginning, I wasn't really a big classics reader, but as I've read more throughout the last few years, I've realised just how incredible they really are. I would not look down on people who don't read classics or who haven't read classics, but what I would say is that you should definitely give them a go. I think once you give them a go, you can actually see the importance of them. Let me know what you think about classics down below in the comments. Do you agree or disagree with me? Maybe you might want to make a video response if you've got even more to say. Whatever you want to do, just let me know what you think about this whole discussion. And until you get back to me, I will see you all again in my next video.